All right, let's do this thing. So, I do apologize for the quality and the moving around and everything. Um, Now that I'm getting out of quarantine, I should be able to get back to Towson to get a tripod and some other things that I have there. Obviously, I wasn't planning on my wife getting COVID, so let's get to it. By now, you should have your tie wire. This is a used roll from a past student, um, and they did an entire project with it. And you can see how much I got left. I've used this to fix my daughter's bed and a bunch of other things. So again, this will last you good part of your life. Probably come in handy many times especially once you get to learn how to use it. So let's go over some things real quick. So hopefully by now you have your wire, and you also have some needle nose pliers. All right. And this is a little bit large, somewhere around the size of your hands. I think I said around 6 inches. But you should have something like this, hopefully. Hopefully you looked at those links. You got something, one thing to check. See if the tips actually meet, right? There we go. Because if that very top point doesn't meet, it just depends on how big that gap is. You could probably still grab the wire, but you can't get super fine things like you would with tweezers. So anyway, so here's the pliers. We're going to talk about this a little bit, and then right in here in the middle, that's that opening where there are two blades, right, for cutting the wire. So that's where you're going to cut wire. So if you don't have these, you might have some other things, like maybe you got a very small pair of pliers, right? They might be called like jeweler's needle nose pliers or something, right? So you'll be able to work with this. They do have the cutter attachment on there, but it's just small, right? So that means you're going to be using a little bit more muscles in your hands. It's going to be harder to cut the wire, which some people have difficulty with anyway, because you have less leverage here. And the same just with bending, twisting, forming. So it's going to be smaller. If you got a pair of pliers, big or small, they're kind of needle nose. The reason we want needle nose is so you can use them to do small attachments, wrap tight little coils, do detailed work. But if you got something that looks more like this, where there's no cutter attachment, well, then you're going to need an alternative cutter. So you'll probably have to see if you have a pair of these, just wire cutters. And if you have problems cutting your wire and you keep practicing, trying, and it's just not working out, then you could always get a pair of these anyway. Right? So that's basically what's on the needle nose pliers if you got that. Now there's other types of pliers. Now a set of pliers like these, let's say you don't have anything else, but you look in your friend's toolbox, you got an old set like this. You can use this to do most of the work. It's going to get a little bit more difficult, especially with the tip not being as long of a contact space for you to work with the wire, and then because they're not needle nose, they don't come to a fine point. It's going to be harder to get in tight spaces and do some of those really tight connections. Now these, a lot of people don't realize it, actually do have wire cutters. This little space down here, right there where that little nook is at the tip of my thumb, in between those two spaces, it becomes a shear, and that can cut the wires. Now it won't work if this is loose at all, and it's got to be loose to work sometimes. So what you have to do is hold this in place and then tighten up this nut as much as you can so that you have a nice connection between these two surfaces, and that will shear the wire off right there. So it's a little bit more difficult than like a pair of wire cutters, needle nose pliers, but it will work. All right. So same thing here. To cut the wire with this, you're simply going to go in and put it inside that channel and then squeeze. Now what will happen sometimes is people will go to cut the wire, especially when you're tired, and you'll get it in that channel and you might be looking from one side, but what you won't realize is that it's going through the channel, but then it's actually getting wedged up there and it won't let you cut. So that's one thing to watch out for. Make sure you got it in there and that's the only place it's contacting. And then also when you go to cut, now I do a tight hard squeeze and it usually just shears, but I'm used to it. If you start squeezing, and these are also really nice, it's not cutting, you've gone all the way down, it's pinched it, squeeze more, wiggle. It's just like cutting with a fork on your plate. Wiggle it, it'll break, right? So that's going to take some time. You're going to build up some muscles in your hand, fingers, forearm. So that's the deal. Pliers, wire, how do we cut it? Okay? All right, so let's take a look at making a wire connection. It's not always as easy as you think. You think wire, we can bend this around. You can bend this around. Now, just like a paper clip, the more you bend around in one area, the more you're stretching that material and making it less flexible, becomes more brittle. Eventually it'll crack if somewhere gets bent too much. So to keep that, keep that in mind. The more it gets bent around, the more difficult it's going to be to bend it. So let's say we want to take this wire and we want to come back here and attach it here. Cross what I might call like a T connection. So one of the main things that you have to learn once you learn how to use your pliers and everything is how to make a nice tight connection. If we ask people to make this connection, a lot of times you take your needle nose pliers and you start to use what's nice about it, that little tip, and people will start to curve and make a loop, right? Okay, that makes sense. Connect that. Now what do we got to loop that around. Okay, that seems good, and then just squeeze, right? Maybe. All right, well that's on there. Problem is it's not tight, which means it's going to slide around. It's not going to stay put. It's more likely to come undone. And when we're building, you make one piece, one structure, let's say this loop. Now I'm going to go and connect a bunch of pieces. Every time you're working with this and bending wire around, it's going to want to move and it's going to pull and it's going to cinch up. So these connections need to be tight. You also don't want to just keep wrapping and wrapping and wrapping because you end up with these big ugly bulges for knots. And that's not going to look good aesthetically and it can be confusing to your structure, your design. So let's take a look at this real quick and I'll draw a diagram for the class at some point here. But if we take this loop, and you can wrap around a bunch of times and make it more and more and more strong, but again, you don't need that much, right? So let's take a look here. So if we can see this, what we want to do is you've got this around, it's wrapping around in a loop, but if we go and just squeeze it, it creates kind of a football shape, right? Here, and then it's smushed. It sandwiches it in there, but it's not wrapped tightly. So how do we get this? If we pull on this, it doesn't want to pull anymore. It kind of cinches up, but how do we get that to be a tight wrap? This is the move right here. All right, so the wire is wrapped around, comes over on top of itself and comes over. What we want to do is get our needle nose pliers, jaws, touching one part of the bottom loop. So if there's wrapped around multiple times, you don't want to overlap in a bunch because it won't work. So you want one part of the wire down here and then one part up here. And if you only have a small wrap like this, you can put it right on the tip. So like this. So it's only making contact with those two parts. Right? And you can grip it from any direction as long as you can get those two parts. So what you're going to do is grab them, make sure they're making contact in only two parts. And then you're going to squeeze and turn, twist at the same time. So as it's squishing it down, you're also twisting it so it wraps around the cord and gets tighter. So I'm going to come back over here and again squeeze and twist. All right, same thing here. I'm just grabbing one of the coils. It's wrapped up, you know, doubled over now, but squeeze and twist. And I want you just to get a look how tight that coil is. Right? So now it's a nice tight wrap. You know, this is kind of loose, got bent over there, so I can squeeze that together, cinch that up. I can go over here on the other side and grab that edge, squeeze, cinch, and twist just so it minimizes it. All right, so now I have a connection that's tight, it's minimal, which is important visually. And even though it's on the single wire, it hardly wants to slide around. All right, so, and you could get it even tighter than that. So that's a pretty good, strong connection right there. And that's what we want to work towards. Okay. I will say, if you have an issue, cut it off, break it off, keep going. But anyway, when you go to make connections, leave extra wire at the end, so that way you have leverage to pull that wire around, wrap it, and then trim off the extra. So what I did was I just used the very tip, and every time you make a connection, you're wrapping that wire, so you're shortening the length of it. So always make your wires longer than they need to be, so you have a lot of extra room for the connection, then you can trim the extra. So with extra, we're going to make this connection again. This time, especially if you don't like using your pliers, I can brace this wire against it, kind of hold the connection. I'm going to put even another finger here, and then use this length as leverage and start to bend, twist around, trying to keep it tight as I can in the middle. So now I've already got to this point, which makes it easier when I come back to line those, come back, and then twist this up. Take some practice, you get used to it. Super tight connection, not even sliding. Then I can come back, and not the deep part, but this back side, I'm going to shear this off clean. Close to the wire. Oh, see that? We got to do a little wiggle there. Alright, so, and then that little sharp edge, by the way, you'll learn pretty quick as you cut this. It's steel wire. It'll create a sharp edge, and you can easily cut yourself. Alright, so I feel that the burr's still sticking out, so I'll still kind of rub and twist this a little bit more just so it takes that burr off, and it's less likely to scrape me later or grab and rip my shirt open or something. Alright, so making tight little twisty connections, that's one of your goals. Okay. Alright.